The plan was simple. Disappear for a few days, blend in, enjoy the snow. No speeches, no cameras, no politics. Just his family and the mountains. But within hours, J.D. Vance would find himself in the middle of a firestorm. Surrounded, shouted down, and forced to make a decision that could change everything. Vermont's winter was unforgiving. The cold didn't just bite. It clung, sharp enough to remind anyone that nature was in charge here. Snow piled high on the roofs, ski lifts groaned under the weight of riders, and the lodge buzzed with weekend energy. Families moved in and out, dragging their gear, lost in the routine of a holiday. Then, an SUV pulled up to the entrance. Dark, sleek, unmistakable. The kind of vehicle that didn't belong in a place like this. Inside, J.D. Vance exhaled, watching the slopes through the tinted glass. This was supposed to be a break, a chance to breathe. But as soon as the door opened and the cold rushed in, he felt it. Something was off. Heads turned. Whispers started. Someone raised a phone. It had begun. 3 days earlier, J.D. Vance sat in the Oval Office, facing two of the most powerful men in the world. President Trump sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, watching the exchange unfold. Across from Vance, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky leaned forward, eyes sharp, voice firm. The topic wasn't new. Ukraine needed more aid. More weapons. More money. Vance shook his head. We have to focus on America first. His words were calm, but firm. People back home are struggling. We can't keep writing blank checks. Zelensky didn't flinch. If we stop now, Russia wins. The room tensed. A pause stretched between them. Trump, silent, let them go at it. 4 minutes, the discussion turned into a back and forth. Zelensky pushing for support, Vance standing his ground. The frustration in the room thickened. Voices rose. And then, it was over. A handshake. A nod. The meeting ended. By the next morning, it was everywhere. Someone in the room had leaked the conversation. Cable news ran with it. Social media exploded. CNN, J.D. Vance sides against Ukraine, backlash begins. MSNBC, Vice President under fire, where does he really stand? Fox News, tough stance or reckless gamble? Vance takes heat over Ukraine comments. The reactions were immediate. Some called him brave. Finally, a politician putting Americans first. Others called him a traitor, a puppet for Russia. Hashtags trended. #JD Vance traitor climbed to the top. Twitter was relentless. Vance scrolled through his phone, reading post after post. Disgraceful. This guy is done in politics. Finally, someone saying what needs to be said. J.D. Vance needs to resign now. He put his phone down. He'd been in tough spots before, but this was different. This wasn't just politics. This was personal. By the time he landed in Vermont, the storm was already moving toward him. At first, it was just a few people. A couple holding signs near the entrance, a man with his hood pulled tight, standing by the parking lot, phone raised, recording. Nothing unusual. Nothing to panic about. J.D. Vance noticed them the moment he stepped into the lodge. He didn't react. He had been in politics long enough to know that the real problems weren't the quiet ones. It was when the volume started rising. And it did. By midday, the numbers had doubled. Then tripled. Voices carried through the cold air, bouncing off the wooden walls of the resort. More signs appeared. Some in English. Some in Ukrainian. Some with his name crossed out in bold red letters. Through the lodge windows, he watched as the crowd outside thickened. They weren't just holding signs anymore. They were moving. Restless. Their voices louder. The words clearer. J.D. Vance, you're a disgrace. Stand with Ukraine. Go back where you came from. Inside, the resort had started to shift. Families who had arrived for a weekend of skiing and relaxation were now whispering in worried tones. Parents clutched their children a little closer. The once friendly atmosphere of the lodge had turned tense. A few guests had noticed him. Some nodded politely, pretending not to stare. Others just left. Usher, his wife, sat by the fireplace, scrolling through her phone. She didn't say anything, but her face said enough. The news had caught on. Every major channel was now running live footage. The crowd outside wasn't just a local protest. It was turning into something much bigger. The resort manager approached, looking uncomfortable. He hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Vice President, we, just wanted to make sure everything's okay." Vance didn't answer right away. He glanced at the front entrance, where security had started to reposition. "Everything's fine," he finally said, voice flat. But it wasn't. Guests were checking out early. Some had already packed up, wheeling their suitcases past the front desk, eyes darting toward the crowd outside. Staff whispered behind the counter, exchanging uneasy glances. A security radio crackled. A muffled voice spoke urgently. "They're moving toward the entrance." Vance's head snapped toward the door. Outside, the chanting had intensified. The protesters had pushed forward, pressing against the glass, fists raised. A man with a thick coat and fur-lined hat lifted a megaphone to his mouth. "J.D. Vance, face the people." The lodge manager's hands clenched into fists. He turned to Vance. "We need to get this under control." Agent Reed, his lead security officer, stepped in without waiting. "Sir, we need to leave. Now." Vance exhaled. He wasn't afraid of a protest. But this wasn't just a protest anymore. It was something else. Something unpredictable. Agent Reed's voice was firm, cutting through the rising tension. "We move now. Side exit. No main road." J.D. Vance nodded. There was no time to argue. The protest outside had grown into a full-scale mob. The lodge doors rattled under the weight of angry fists. Security had locked the main entrance, but it wouldn't hold for long. "Stay close," Reed instructed, her voice calm but urgent. Vance tightened his coat, grabbed his son's hand, and moved. His wife, Usher, kept her arm around their youngest, her eyes scanning the room. The Secret Service formed a tight circle around them as they headed toward a narrow hallway near the ski rental shop. The air smelled like damp wool and fresh snow. Outside, the shouting grew louder. "Vance, face the people. Traitor. Support Ukraine." The service door creaked open. Cold wind rushed in. Snow crunched under their feet as they hurried across the back lot toward the waiting SUVs. The vehicles had been positioned away from the main entrance, hidden behind a row of maintenance sheds. If they moved fast, they could be gone before the protesters even realized. But they weren't fast enough. "There he is." The voice rang out, sharp and furious. Heads snapped in their direction. A group of protesters near the lower ski lift spotted them. For half a second, there was silence. Then chaos. A surge of bodies rushed toward them. Some ran. Others stumbled over the icy ground, waving signs, raising phones, screaming his name. The Secret Service snapped into action. "Go! Move!" The family was shoved forward. Boots hit ice. Someone slipped. Usher gripped Vance's arm. Their kids were pulled into the security formation, their faces pale with fear. Then came the first object. A plastic water bottle arced through the air, smacking against the side of the SUV with a hollow thud. A harmless hit. Then another, this time, a coffee cup. Then a fistful of snow, packed tight, aimed at his head. It missed. But the mood had shifted. The protest wasn't just loud anymore. It was angry. A man in a heavy coat stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. He wasn't holding a sign. He wasn't yelling. He was just staring, unblinking, as if daring Vance to stop and face him. Then, from somewhere deep in the crowd, "You don't get to run, J.D." A second wave of movement. More bodies pressing forward. Agent Reed's voice was sharp. "Inside. Now." Vance barely had time to glance back before he was shoved into the SUV. The door slammed. Locks clicked. His wife and kids were already inside, their breathing fast, their hands gripping the seats. Outside, the crowd swarmed closer. Another impact. This time, Something heavier, a travel mug, maybe. It hit the roof of the SUV with a dull metallic clang. Then fists. Protesters pounded against the vehicle, palms slamming into the windows. Their shouts were muffled but clear. Coward! You betrayed US. America stands with Ukraine. The convoy roared to life. Tires spun against the icy ground. The lead vehicle pulled out first, forcing a gap in the crowd. The others followed. As they sped away, the last thing Vance saw through the tinted glass was a man holding a Ukrainian flag high above his head. His breath visible in the freezing air, his face twisted in fury. But this wasn't over. Not even close. The radio crackled. Sir, protesters are mobilizing in Burlington. We need a new route. Vance closed his eyes. This was just the beginning. The SUV sped down the snow-covered road, winding through the mountains, leaving the chaos of the resort behind. Inside, J.D. Vance sat stiffly, his phone buzzing non-stop. He didn't check it. He already knew what was happening. The world was watching. Cable news had picked up the footage before he had even left the parking lot. Clips of protesters shouting, throwing objects, banging on the SUV. It was everywhere. CNN, J.D. Vance flees angry crowd. Backlash explodes over Ukraine stance. MSNBC, Vice President confronts public outrage. Is this the end of his political future? Fox News, did the media just turn J.D. Vance into a villain? It wasn't just TV. Social media had erupted. His name trended on every platform. Twitter was a war zone. Some defended him. He had no choice. The man was protecting his family. Since when is it a crime to put Americans first? Others tore him apart. He ran, just like every coward before him. Traitor, get him out of office. Memes flooded in. A picture of him stepping into the SUV with the words "JD flees" plastered across the top. A screenshot of a protester yelling, captioned "Come back and explain yourself." Vance rubbed his temple. He had expected a reaction, but not like this. The story wasn't about his position anymore. It wasn't about aid to Ukraine. It was about him. His phone rang. Chief of Staff. He let it go to voicemail. Usher sat beside him, scrolling through her own screen, reading headlines. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The weight of it all sat heavy in the space between them. Agent Reed turned in her seat, her voice calm but firm. Sir, the media has full control of this story. If you don't address it soon, it will spiral. Vance exhaled. He knew she was right. He had been in politics long enough to understand the game. It didn't matter what was true. It mattered what people believed. He wasn't just dealing with a backlash. He was losing control of the narrative. And if he didn't turn it around fast, it would cost him everything. The safe house was quiet. Too quiet. J.D. Vance sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the phone in his hand. The screen flickered with notifications, messages from his team, headlines from the media, reactions from the public. He had seen enough. A heavy silence filled the room. His chief of staff stood near the window, arms crossed, waiting. Usher sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, expression unreadable. Outside, the wind howled against the glass. You need to speak, the chief of staff finally said, breaking the tension. If you don't, they'll define this for you. Vance knew he was right. The media had already framed the story. Protesters weren't just angry. They had chased him out. He hadn't just left. He had fled. His stance on Ukraine wasn't about policy anymore. It was about loyalty. If he stayed silent, he lost. Vance exhaled, rubbing his temple. We do it now. The team moved quickly. The living room transformed into a broadcast space. Camera set up, lighting adjusted, microphones checked. A laptop streamed directly to networks, social media, everywhere that mattered. Vance sat at the table, hands resting on the smooth wood. The countdown started. 3, 2, 1. The red light blinked on. I want to address what happened today. His voice was steady. No fluff. No hesitation. I went to Vermont with my family, hoping for a quiet weekend. I knew there were people upset with my stance on Ukraine. That's their right. But when protests turn into something more, when anger replaces debate, we lose something important. A pause. Just enough for the words to settle. Let me be clear. I stand by what I said in the White House. My duty is to the American people first. That does not mean I ignore the suffering overseas. It means our priorities start here, at home. His jaw tightened slightly. I did not run. I protected my family. And I will never apologize for that. Another pause. Just enough weight behind it. We can have real discussions. We can disagree. But if we allow rage to replace reason, we destroy what makes this country strong. A final breath. That's all I have to say. The screen cut to black. The room stayed silent. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of wind outside. Then the phone buzzed. The first reaction had already come in. And the battle for the narrative had begun. The safe house was still. The only sound came from the television, where a panel of commentators picked apart every word J.D. Vance had just said. He sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him, staring at the screen but not really watching. His phone was buzzing every few seconds. Messages, updates, reactions pouring in non-stop. His chief of staff stood near the doorway, arms crossed, eyes fixed on his phone. "You're the top story on every network," he finally said. "And it's not going away anytime soon." Vance exhaled, rubbing his temple. "What's the damage?" The man hesitated, then started reading aloud. "CNN says your speech was damage control, a desperate attempt to regain footing. Fox News is split. Some hosts say you showed strength. Others say this could hurt you in 2028. MSNBC is calling it spin, claiming you dodged responsibility." Vance leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "And the people?" His chief of staff scrolled through his phone. "Depends who you ask." On one side, his supporters rallied behind him. He stood his ground. Finally, someone putting America first. The media is trying to destroy him, but he's not backing down. This is why we need leaders who aren't afraid to tell the truth. On the other, the criticism was relentless. Coward. He ran, then tried to play the victim. So he cares more about being popular than standing up to Putin. He showed his true colors, and it's not red, white, and blue. Then came the memes. Some mocking him, others defending him. One of his SUV speeding away with the caption "JD's ski trip, 1 star." Another, a split image, on the left, the protesters outside the lodge. On the right, his speech, captioned "Reality versus Spin." The reaction wasn't a surprise. He had expected backlash. But what he hadn't anticipated was how deeply divided the country was over him now. Usher sat across from him, her phone glowing with updates. She shook her head. "You've become the conversation." He knew what she meant. This wasn't just about policy anymore. It wasn't even about Ukraine. It was about him. By noon, the White House press secretary stood behind the podium, flanked by American flags. The reporters wasted no time. "Has President Trump spoken to Vice President Vance about his comments?" A brief pause, then a carefully worded answer. "The President and Vice President have ongoing discussions on a variety of issues. I won't get ahead of that." Another journalist jumped in. "But is the administration aligned on Ukraine? It seems like there's a divide." The press secretary smiled, tight and professional. "Our focus remains on supporting our allies while ensuring that America's interests come first." Translation? The White House wasn't throwing him under the bus. But they weren't exactly backing him either. Vance watched the press conference from the safe house, arms crossed. He had been in politics long enough to understand what they were really saying. They were watching. If public opinion turned too far against him, they wouldn't hesitate to distance themselves. Back in Vermont, the crowd outside the ski resort had grown overnight. What started as a demonstration had now turned into an ongoing standoff. A protester wrapped in a Ukrainian flag told reporters, "He thinks he can just talk his way out of this. We're not going anywhere." Counter-protesters had started showing up too. A man in a heavy coat held a sign that read "America First." Another waved a flag with bold letters, "Vance was right." The country wasn't just debating J.D. Vance. It was fighting over him. And that was what made this different. This wasn't just a PR crisis. It was a turning point. Late that night, Vance sat alone in the safe house. The TV muted, the room dim. Outside, the wind howled against the walls. Usher sat across from him, studying his face. "Did you do the right thing?" He didn't answer right away. He stared at the darkened screen, the reflection of his own tired expression staring back at him. Finally, he sighed. "I don't know." A pause. Then, quieter, "But I wouldn't change what I said." She didn't push him on it. She just nodded. Because she understood. This wasn't about Ukraine anymore. It was about something bigger. And whether he liked it or not, he was at the center of it. The weekend ended, but the controversy didn't. If anything, it grew. Vance had learned a lesson, not just about politics, but about perception. It didn't matter what he meant. It mattered what people heard. It didn't matter what was true. It mattered what they believed. And in today's world, truth wasn't what set you free. It was what trapped you. He wasn't sure what that meant for his future. But he knew one thing. This fight wasn't over. Not even close. The debate isn't over. The protests, the backlash, the support, it's all still unfolding. But this isn't just about J.D. Vance anymore. It's about where you stand. Do you think he was right to put America first? Or do you believe he turned his back on an ally? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear from you. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because this is just the beginning.